A black doctor returns from a medical mission. But what happens at the airport will leave you speechless. After 6 months overseas providing critical care in war-torn regions, Dr. Marcus Bennett was finally heading home. His bags were light, but the weight of exhaustion sat heavy on his shoulders. Stepping off the plane into the airport terminal, he exhaled, ready to reclaim the peace he had left behind. But peace, as Marcus would soon learn, was not waiting for him. In the security line, a uniformed officer locked eyes with Marcus, and from that moment, the air shifted. With no reason, no explanation, Marcus was pulled aside, his belongings searched, and his credentials questioned, right there in front of curious eyes and lowered voices. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked calmly, his hands steady as they gripped the strap of his medical bag. "There could be," the officer replied, his tone laced with something Marcus recognized all too well. But what happened next turned the situation on its head. 7 minutes later, as Marcus stood firm, refusing to be humiliated, the officer was escorted away, fired on the spot, and the chain of events that followed left everyone watching in stunned silence. Stay with me. This is a story about standing tall, even when the world tries to make you small. The seat by the window wasn't just a seat. Lila Thompson knew that much. It wasn't leather and steel, nor was it purchased by the click of a button. It was carved out of decades. No, centuries of toil. A quiet assertion in a world that made a habit of denying her people even the smallest comforts. As the plane filled with the slow shuffle of boarding passengers, she sat still, watching the sun bleed out over the tarmac. The day had been long, and she was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Yet, here she was, upright and calm, as if holding on to this seat meant holding on to more than the promise of a smooth flight. She felt it in the air, the way eyes lingered on her as they passed. It wasn't overt, no one dared to make it obvious. But Lila had lived long enough to recognize the weight of assumptions hanging just beyond polite glances. She didn't mind anymore. If life had taught her anything, it was that shadows of doubt could only take shape if you let them. A young man in a crisp uniform smiled as he handed her a glass of water. His gaze lingered just a moment longer than it should have. Lila held his eye, a habit, born not of hostility but of necessity, making herself visible in places people pretended not to see her. The attendant moved on, and Lila returned to the window, letting the quiet hum of the engines settle in her chest. For a moment, it seemed like this flight would be ordinary. But ordinary was a luxury she had rarely been afforded. The woman appeared as if conjured by the very fabric of inevitability. Tall, blonde, wrapped in privilege like a well-tailored coat. Lila noticed her before she spoke, before she stood square in the aisle beside her. The woman's presence wasn't loud, but it demanded attention, the kind that turned heads without raising voices. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice soft but rigid. Lila turned slowly, taking her in piece by piece. The way her eyes lingered on Lila's briefcase, the silk scarf at her neck, the uprightness of her posture. "I believe there's been a mistake." Lila set down her glass and met the woman's gaze directly. "I don't think there has." The woman smiled the way people do when they're certain they will get what they want. "I always sit in 3A, she said, motioning toward the seat. "This is 3A. The woman's smile faded, replaced by something sharper, though still wrapped in civility. Lila didn't move, she didn't blink. A hush gathered in the cabin. Not full silence, but the soft murmur of people pretending not to notice. The flight attendant, the same one who had handed Lila the water, reappeared as if summoned. His glance flickered between them, his practiced politeness already bending toward the woman standing, not the one seated. "Is there a problem?" "I believe there is," the woman said, gesturing toward Lila without sparing her a glance. "This seat must have been assigned in error. I'm a platinum member." The attendant's eyes softened with apology as they landed on Lila. "Ms. Thompson, would you mind?" Quote. "I would," Lila interrupted, her voice steady. The attendant hesitated, unsure how to proceed. He had not expected resistance. "I booked this seat weeks ago," Lila continued, tilting her head slightly. "I'll be staying right here." The woman let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "I'm sure we can work something out. It's just a seat." Lila's gaze hardened. Exactly. And it's mine. The woman's eyes narrowed just slightly, though her smile remained, stretched thin over quiet indignation. The attendant shifted, uncertain, the weight of expectation pressing down on him. I'll speak with the supervisor, he said at last, disappearing down the aisle. Lila leaned back, reclaiming the quiet, though the air felt heavier now. This wasn't about a seat. It rarely was. As she glanced once more at the fading horizon, she thought of her mother, who used to remind her, some fights you'll choose, others will choose you. Lila suspected this fight had chosen her long before she stepped on board. The weight of the air around Lila seemed to thicken, not suddenly, but gradually, like the slow tightening of a knot. The flight attendant returned, his footsteps lighter than before, as if treading carefully might soften the edges of what was to come. Behind him, a second figure followed, a woman in her late 40s. Her uniform crisp, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted floor. The badge pinned to her lapel identified her as Olivia Grant, the flight supervisor. Lila noticed the subtle arch of her brow, the polite yet clipped smile, and the careful neutrality in her eyes. Ms. Thompson, Olivia began, her voice laced with rehearsed empathy, the kind used when addressing someone who had been mistaken for a problem rather than a passenger. I'm Olivia Grant, the cabin supervisor. I understand there's been some confusion about seating. There's no confusion, Lila replied evenly. This is my seat. Olivia folded her hands in front of her. Mrs. Hastings, here, typically flies in this seat. She's a loyal platinum member, and we try to accommodate our frequent flyers when possible. Would you consider switching to 5C? It's still in first class. The request sounded simple, reasonable even, dressed in the polite language of customer service. But Lila knew better. These moments were never as small as they appeared. She took a breath, her fingers resting lightly on the briefcase in her lap. I'm not moving. A faint tension flickered across Olivia's face. The kind that whispered of inconveniences piling up. The kind that said, why can't you just let this go? Claudia Hastings, still standing in the aisle, folded her arms with the casual impatience of someone accustomed to getting her way. Her eyes skimmed over Lila, dismissive but watchful, as if waiting for the inevitable shift of power that would set things right. Her version of right. You can't seriously expect me to take another seat, Claudia said, her voice soft but with a sharp undercurrent that cut through the polite veneer. I'm a platinum member for a reason. Lila let the words settle in the air, allowing their weight to reveal the thing neither of them dared to say out loud. Platinum doesn't override my reservation, Lila replied, her tone smooth but unrelenting. Olivia shifted, her hands tightening around the tablet she carried. Ms. Thompson, I assure you we would never ask this if it wasn't necessary. It would just make things easier. Lila's gaze didn't waver. Easier for who? The question seemed to land heavier than Olivia expected. Lila could see the gears turning behind Olivia's polite smile. The mental arithmetic of power dynamics. The careful balancing act of appeasing one passenger at the expense of another. This was the tightrope they walked every day. And the world had trained them to believe that tipping the scale toward people like Claudia Hastings was simply the path of least resistance. Claudia exhaled loudly, her sigh exaggerated, meant for the surrounding passengers to hear. I don't see why this has to be difficult, she muttered, her voice just loud enough to carry. I'm sure she doesn't fly first class often. There it was. Lila felt the words like a stone skipping across still water. Small but causing ripples that stretched far beyond the moment. She met Claudia's gaze directly. Unflinching. I fly first class as often as I choose. Claudia blinked, caught off guard by the simple weight of the response. But Olivia stepped in quickly, eager to smooth the surface before the ripples turned into waves. Ms. Thompson, perhaps I can offer compensation for the inconvenience? Olivia's smile returned, though thinner now. A complimentary upgrade on your next flight? Lila's eyes narrowed. She recognized this game, and she had no intention of playing it. I don't need compensation, she said softly. I need you to respect the seat I paid for. For a fleeting second, Olivia hesitated. Lila saw it. The quiet crack in the polished facade. The brief flash of recognition in Olivia's eyes that said, this isn't about a seat. And you know it. But the flash was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced once more by the carefully measured professionalism that kept Olivia's world in balance. I'll speak to the captain, Olivia said, her voice dropping as if extending some final olive branch. Lila nodded, though the words were meaningless. She had already made her decision. As Olivia turned to leave, Claudia leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice so only Lila could hear. You know, there was a time when people like you knew their place. Lila's hand stilled over her briefcase, her chest tightening for the briefest of moments. But then she smiled, slow, deliberate, the kind of smile that unsettled more than reassured. There was, Lila replied, and I remember exactly how it ended. The words hung there, suspended between them, as Claudia's eyes narrowed into thin slits of frustration. Lila turned back to her window, exhaling softly as the sun dipped lower behind the clouds. The fight wasn't over, but Lila had long learned that the strongest battles weren't fought with fists or fury. They were won by refusing to move. The hush that followed Olivia's departure was not one of peace but of suspension. The kind that feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting to see which way the wind will blow. Lila could feel it, the collective discomfort pressing in from all sides. The weight of unspoken words carried on glances that flickered toward her seat and quickly away. As if eye contact alone might implicate them in this small, unfolding drama. Claudia Hastings remained standing, her arms crossed in a way that suggested the matter was already settled in her mind. She had done what people like her always did. Laid claim to something, wrapped it in the soft language of policy and preference, and expected the world to rearrange itself accordingly. But the world, at least for the moment, was not cooperating. Lila could feel Claudia's eyes, sharp and narrow, lingering on the back of her head like a blade without a hilt. The flight attendant, Peter, she remembered now, hovered awkwardly at the edge of the row, unsure if he should stay or retreat. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, the way young men do when they're not yet practiced in navigating the discomfort of other people's entitlement. Lila glanced at him briefly. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Is there anything else I can get you, Ms. Thompson? Peter asked, his voice thin, as if each word tiptoed out of his mouth. No, thank you, Lila replied, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Claudia's gaze sharpened further, her arms tightening against her chest. You know, Claudia said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like the edge of a glass. I find it fascinating how quickly things have changed. A few years ago, this wouldn't have been an issue. People respected tradition. Lila turned her head slightly, just enough to catch Claudia's reflection in the window. I didn't know seat assignments were a tradition, Lila replied, her voice soft but carrying the full weight of the exchange. Claudia's lips thinned. It's not about the seat. It's about courtesy. There's nothing courteous about asking someone to give up something that's rightfully theirs. The words hung in the air, heavier than before. Lila could sense the shift around her. The other passengers were listening now. Not just pretending, not politely averting their gaze, but truly listening, the way people do when something disrupts the quiet order they take for granted. Across the aisle, an older man lowered his newspaper slightly, his eyes skimming the top edge. A woman a few rows back exchanged a glance with her seatmate. And yet, no one spoke. It was always like this. People were willing to witness discomfort but rarely willing to intervene. Lila had long accepted that there was no cavalry coming. No kindly stranger waiting to rise in defense of her dignity. Those stories lived in books, not airplanes. Claudia seemed to sense this, too. I imagine you'll want to avoid causing a scene, Claudia said, tilting her head in the way people do when they believe they're offering a lifeline. Surely this can't be worth all the fuss. Lila smiled faintly. I'm not the one causing the scene. Claudia's face darkened just slightly, though her polite mask held. Peter took a small step back, pretending to straighten a nearby curtain, though it was clear he wanted no part of what was transpiring. The silence stretched further until, mercifully for some, Olivia Grant returned. She moved with the precision of someone accustomed to extinguishing small fires before they spread. Her eyes carefully assessing the cabin as she approached. The captain will be down shortly to discuss the situation, Olivia announced. though the words felt unnecessary. The cabin already sensed that the matter had escalated. Claudia straightened, smoothing her blouse as if preparing for an audience. Lila remained still. She had been here before. Different settings, different faces, but the same undercurrent, the same quiet machinery at work beneath the surface. The thing about moments like this was that they were never isolated. They were echoes. They carried with them the weight of every small indignity that had come before. The times she had been asked to prove herself twice over. The moments her presence had been questioned. The assumptions that clung to her no matter how many boardrooms she entered or titles she earned. It wasn't just about a seat. It never was. Lila breathed in, slow and steady. She had no intention of standing. The cabin door opened with a low hiss. And when the captain stepped in, the air seemed to shift around him. He wasn't a tall man. Nor was he particularly commanding in stature. But authority, real authority, rarely required volume. It lived in the way a person carried themselves. In the way they measured a room with their eyes and made sure everyone knew they had been seen. Captain Marshall, his name stitched neatly into his uniform, had that look. The look of a man who had long learned how to balance the tightrope between keeping the peace and holding his ground. Lila watched him carefully, noting the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. The way his gaze flicked briefly to Claudia Hastings and then to her. His smile was faint but polite. The kind that came with a practiced warmth. Not a genuine one. "Good evening, ladies," he began, folding his hands in front of him. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding seating." "There's no confusion," Claudia interjected before Lila could respond. "I've flown this route for years. And I've never had an issue until today. This is my seat. Always has been." Captain Marshall turned to Lila. His expression measured. "Ms. Thompson, I take it this is your assigned seat?" Lila met his gaze without hesitation. "It is." She saw the faint flicker of recognition in his eyes. The same recognition she had seen countless times before. It wasn't outright hostility or disbelief. No, this was something quieter, more insidious. A small part of him had already decided that Claudia Hastings wasn't the sort to lie. But Lila wasn't the sort to move. She reached for her briefcase, sliding her boarding pass free and holding it out between them, the proof resting in her palm. "Here's my ticket," she said, her voice even. Captain Marshall took it without a word, his eyes scanning the small slip as if searching for a flaw. Some crack in the narrative that might make this whole thing disappear. When he found none, he handed it back, offering the same thin smile. "It seems there's been no mistake," he said, turning to Claudia. Claudia's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening around the handle of her designer bag. "This is absurd," she snapped. "I've been a platinum member for nearly a decade. I'm entitled to priority seating." Lila watched the words sink into the space between them, stretching the room in uncomfortable silence. Entitled. That was the heart of it, wasn't it? The belief that access could be bought. That spaces could be rearranged at will. And that certain people like Lila, were always just a little more movable. Captain Marshall exhaled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Hastings, but Miss Thompson has rightfully reserved this seat. I'm afraid I can't ask her to move." Claudia's lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but making sure it carried just far enough for Lila to hear. "I doubt she even flies first class regularly," Claudia said, shaking her head. "You know how these things happen. Last-minute upgrades, promotions, some mistake at the counter." "I'm sure." Lila sat still, her hands resting lightly on the leather briefcase in her lap. There was a time when she might have flinched at those words. When she might have turned her head and let them pass over her like a wave. But that time had long since passed. She met Claudia's gaze, holding it steady until the woman faltered, her confidence flickering beneath the weight of silence. "I didn't buy an upgrade," Lila said, her voice calm but firm. "I paid for this seat the same way you did. Maybe sooner." Claudia's mouth opened, but the words stalled somewhere along the way. Captain Marshall, sensing the fragile edge they were teetering on, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hastings," he said, gentler this time, "there's a seat available in 5C. It's still first class, and I'd be happy to make arrangements for your comfort." For a long moment, Claudia said nothing. She wasn't the sort of woman who backed down easily. And Lila knew that moving to 5C wasn't the issue. Not really. The issue was the seat by the window. The issue was losing. Claudia glanced once more at Lila. Something sharp and unreadable in her eyes. Then, with a forced laugh, she stepped back, tucking her bag under her arm. Well, she said, lifting her chin, I suppose everyone gets lucky sometimes. It wasn't meant to be heard. But Lila caught every word. She said nothing in return, watching as Claudia disappeared down the aisle, her heels tapping out a slow, measured retreat. Captain Marshall lingered for a moment, offering Lila a brief nod. I appreciate your patience, Ms. Thompson. Enjoy the rest of your flight. Lila smiled faintly. I always do. As the captain disappeared into the cockpit and the cabin returned to its muted hum, Lila leaned back into her seat, watching the tarmac drift by as the plane prepared for takeoff. The fight wasn't loud. It never was. It was always like this. A game of inches. A quiet reshuffling of who belonged and who did not. But not today. Today, she was exactly where she intended to be. The plane was in the air now, carving its quiet path through the night. The cabin lights had dimmed, and the hum of the engines became the kind of constant sound that almost felt like silence. Lila sat upright, her eyes skimming the pages of a book she wasn't reading. Words drifted past her, their meaning secondary to the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. A few rows ahead, Claudia Hastings sat rigid in 5C. Lila could feel her there, even if she never turned her head. That was the thing about encounters like this. They didn't end when the conversation stopped. They lingered, like smoke that settles into your clothes long after the fire is gone. Claudia's presence wasn't loud, but it pressed against Lila's awareness like a stone lodged beneath the skin. She could almost hear the thoughts turning over in Claudia's head. The way she might later retell this story at some garden party or fundraiser. You wouldn't believe what happened to me on the flight. A mix-up with the seats. Some woman in first class who didn't belong there. Maybe not in those exact words. But Lila knew the shape of it. She had heard it before. The book in her lap remained open. But Lila's mind drifted elsewhere. Back to the smaller moments that didn't make headlines. The subtle but certain steps people like Claudia took to remind others of their place. She remembered the early days. Walking into rooms where she was the only one like her. The meetings where her ideas were questioned until someone else repeated them. The eyes that scanned her clothes. Her hair. Her very existence. Searching for the slightest crack. As if the simple act of being there required justification. Even now, seated in the dim glow of first class, Lila felt it. That unspoken agreement the world had made long ago. Some people were owed comfort. Others had to earn it. And even when they earned it, someone was always waiting to take it back. Across the aisle, the flight attendant Peter moved carefully, refilling glasses and placing small plates of food on linen napkins. His eyes flicked to Lila once or twice, lingering longer than necessary. She recognized that look too. The nervous glance of someone who hadn't expected trouble but found himself caught in its orbit. He approached her seat hesitantly. Ms. Thompson, he said softly, as if the sound of her name might break something fragile. Is there anything I can get you? Lila set the book aside, meeting his eyes with a calm that made him shift uncomfortably. I'm fine, she replied, her voice steady. Peter hesitated, then nodded and stepped away. But not before glancing toward Claudia, who hadn't looked up from the glossy magazine she pretended to read. Lila watched him go. She knew why he lingered. It wasn't concern. It was guilt. Peter was young. He hadn't meant to take sides. But that's how it happened. Wasn't it? A slight tilt in the wrong direction. A hesitation that betrayed where his loyalties lay. However briefly, he would learn. As Olivia Grant had, that neutrality was often a luxury for those who already had power. For everyone else, silence had a cost. Lila leaned back into her seat, letting the quiet surround her. But the quiet did not last. A voice rose from 5C, low but sharp enough to carry. I don't understand why it took so long to resolve that, Claudia said, turning to the passenger beside her. It's not like I was asking for much. People should know their place. Lila didn't flinch, But the words wrapped around her like wire, tightening with each syllable. The man seated next to Claudia, a silver-haired businessman with tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably. He muttered something polite, the way people do when they wish to remain apart from whatever storm is gathering. Claudia wasn't talking to him. Anyway, she was talking to the room. To Lila. The challenge was subtle, but it was there, thinly veiled beneath the weight of a carefully crafted sentence. Lila exhaled slowly, pressing her palms together. There was a time when she might have let this go. But that time was gone. She stood quietly, stepping into the aisle. The soft sound of her footsteps drew attention. Though Lila's expression never shifted, she walked slowly toward the front of the cabin, her movements calm but deliberate, until she stood just beside Claudia's row. For a moment, she said nothing. Claudia looked up, surprised, as if the confrontation she had been quietly summoning had arrived sooner than expected. "Excuse me," Lila said, her voice as smooth as glass. "But I couldn't help overhearing you." Claudia blinked, masking her discomfort with a thin smile. "Oh, I wasn't talking about you." Quote. Lila raised a hand, silencing her. "I know what you were talking about," she said, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the hum of the plane. "And I've heard it before. You tell yourself it's not personal, that it's just policy, just tradition, but we both know what it is." Claudia's smile faded. The businessman beside her looked away, suddenly engrossed in his newspaper. "I didn't mean to offend," Claudia said, though the apology felt paper-thin. "You didn't offend me," Lila replied, leaning in just slightly. "But I'm not moving. Not then. Not now. And if that's something you need to take up with someone, I suggest you think about why that is." The cabin was still, the other passengers suddenly attentive in the quiet, private way people are when they witness something they know they shouldn't. Lila waited just long enough to ensure Claudia understood the weight of what had passed between them. Then, without another word, she returned to her seat, lifting the book from her lap as if nothing had happened. The rest of the flight passed in silence. But Lila knew the conversation wasn't over. It never was. The plane carved its way through the night sky. But inside the cabin, there was a stillness, a quiet that felt deliberate, as if the air itself had been instructed to hold its breath. Lila Thompson returned to her seat, but the weight of her exchange with Claudia Hastings lingered like a storm cloud that refused to break. She could feel it in the eyes of the passengers who dared to glance her way, in the polite avoidance of the flight crew, and in the empty space Claudia now occupied, not physically, but in the air between them. The businessman seated beside Claudia no longer pretended to read. His paper rested in his lap, untouched, his gaze fixed firmly ahead. He looked like a man who wanted to disappear, to melt into the upholstery and emerge only when the plane's wheels met the ground. Lila understood that impulse well. She had spent years perfecting the art of disappearance, learning how to exist without being seen, to navigate spaces that weren't meant for her, and to slip through cracks without disturbing the foundation. But that was the thing about disappearing. Eventually, you grew tired of it. Lila could feel Claudia shifting in her seat, restless now, though she hadn't said another word. There was no mistaking the tension that draped itself over her shoulders like an ill-fitting coat. She was losing, and the realization sat uncomfortably on her skin. Lila had no interest in dragging the moment further. There was no satisfaction in this. No triumph in forcing a woman like Claudia to confront the fragile scaffolding of her own entitlement. And yet, the moment wasn't done with them. It rarely was. A soft chime echoed through the cabin as Olivia Grant, the flight supervisor, reappeared at the front, her expression carefully composed. Lila noticed the way Olivia's eyes scanned the rows, landing first on Claudia, then flicking briefly to her. There was a hesitation, a pause so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't spent their life studying such things. But Lila noticed. "Mrs. Hastings," Olivia began, her voice just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. "I wanted to apologize for the earlier misunderstanding. I've spoken with the captain, and we'd like to offer you a complimentary voucher for your inconvenience." Lila's fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. She kept her face still. But inside, something shifted. Of course. There was always a concession. Always a small token to smooth the edges. To ensure that people like Claudia walked away feeling justified. Reassured that the world still bent, if only slightly, to their will. Claudia smiled faintly, tucking her hair behind her ear. She tilted her head just enough to glance at Lila out of the corner of her eye. Her expression cool but victorious. Lila let the moment hang, refusing to look away. She could see Olivia's discomfort. The flicker of doubt in the supervisor's eyes, as if some small part of her regretted the decision even as she made it. But regret wasn't enough. Lila didn't need an apology whispered in the shadows while vouchers were handed out in the light. Still, she said nothing, because that was how these things worked. Wasn't it? It was easier to appease than to confront. To offer compensation in place of accountability. Lila had watched it unfold 100 times. In boardrooms, restaurants, hotel lobbies, and now, at 30,000 feet. And so, the plane flew on, carrying them toward their destination, while Lila sat with the quiet understanding that for all the progress they claimed to have made, the machinery of the world still hummed quietly beneath the surface, unchanged and unchallenged. She wondered how many vouchers Claudia Hastings had collected in her lifetime. How many times the world had gently reassured her that she was owed comfort, that her inconvenience was worth more than someone else's dignity. And she wondered how long it would take for someone to decide that the voucher wasn't enough. As the lights dimmed further, Lila rested her head against the window, watching the night stretch endlessly below. It would not be her, but someone, someday, would look up and refuse to disappear. The quiet that followed Olivia Grant's polite betrayal stretched thin, humming just beneath the surface of the cabin. It wasn't loud enough to disturb the other passengers. Not directly. But Lila Thompson could feel it. A low and steady vibration. Like a fault line waiting for the right weight to shift. The world had a way of settling itself after moments like this. People sank into their seats, lulled by the hum of the engines, convincing themselves the turbulence was behind them. But Lila knew better. The ground always remembered where the cracks were. Across the aisle, Claudia Hastings adjusted the blanket on her lap, pretending to read but turning the same page over and over. Her body had gone still, but her mind was restless. Lila could see it, the way Claudia's eyes flicked upward every few minutes, as if expecting someone to call her name and hand her victory, wrapped in the comforting language of apology. But no one came. The businessman beside Claudia had fallen into an uneasy sleep, his head resting awkwardly against the headrest, as if even his dreams were avoiding her. Peter, the young flight attendant, drifted quietly through the aisle, careful to keep his distance from both women, though Lila caught his glance now and then. He wore the face of someone who had already decided where the wrong turn had been made but knew better than to say it aloud. Lila could have let the moment dissolve, allowing the tension to slip away like water through her fingers. It would have been easier. But easy had never been the point. So she waited. And when Olivia Grant reappeared, stepping lightly through the cabin, Lila lifted her head and met the woman's eyes with the kind of calm that makes people nervous. "Ms. Thompson," Olivia said softly, pausing just beside her seat. "Can I get you anything?" Lila studied her, tilting her head just slightly. "I don't need anything," she replied, "but I was wondering if you had a voucher for me, too." The words were quiet, gentle, almost, but they landed with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Olivia blinked, her smile faltering for the briefest second before returning, though thinner now. "Oh," she said, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "The voucher was just a courtesy. Mrs. Hastings flies with us frequently, and we wanted to ensure she left the flight satisfied." Lila nodded slowly. "And what about me?" The question was soft but sharp enough to draw the attention of the businessman 2 rows back, who lowered his newspaper just enough to peer over the edge. Olivia hesitated. "Well, you weren't inconvenienced in the same way." Lila smiled faintly, folding her hands in her lap. "Interesting," she said, her voice never rising, but carrying the weight of the room regardless. "I could have sworn I was." There was no malice in her words. No anger that could be dismissed as overreaction. Just a quiet, unwavering gaze that didn't blink, didn't shift away, didn't allow for escape. Olivia opened her mouth to respond, But nothing came. Because there wasn't anything to say. Not without admitting that the inconvenience Lila spoke of wasn't the kind that earned vouchers. It was older, woven into the edges of rooms. Into the spaces people pretended not to see. It was the kind of inconvenience the world had long since decided wasn't worth compensation. Lila watched as Olivia's hands tightened slightly at her sides, as if searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing there. I suppose some inconveniences are harder to recognize, Lila said after a moment. The words were soft, but they left Olivia standing a little straighter, as if bracing for a wind that had yet to arrive. I'll let you know if I need anything, Lila added, and with that, the conversation ended. Olivia nodded stiffly and disappeared down the aisle, her heels clicking a little faster than before. Lila returned to her book, though she knew she wouldn't read it. Not tonight, because even as the cabin lights dimmed further, even as the plane pressed deeper into the sky, Lila felt the weight of the room shift. Just slightly. The ground beneath them might not have cracked. But it remembered. And so did she. By the time the plane began its descent, the cabin had settled into the thin stillness that always comes before landing. The kind that feels as if the world is holding itself together by a thread. People shifted under blankets, closed books, and straightened their seats, all performing the quiet rituals of returning to Earth. Lila Thompson closed her eyes. Not in rest, but in reflection. There were no more words exchanged between her and Claudia Hastings. But the silence between them had grown heavier, as if both women had retreated into their own thoughts, standing on opposite sides of a line neither had drawn but both recognized. Lila could feel Claudia's discomfort vibrating across the aisle, subtle but persistent, the weight of a woman whose certainty had been bruised, but not broken. That was how it always was. The Claudias of the world didn't shatter. They didn't dissolve under the weight of confrontation. They hardened, wrapping themselves tighter in the belief that they had been wronged, that the world had shifted unfairly beneath their feet. Lila knew better than to expect a grand reckoning. This wasn't that kind of story. But there was something to be said for small fractures. The ones that slipped beneath the surface unnoticed until the structure weakened. And as the plane dipped lower, Lila wondered just how deep this particular crack had run. The lights of the city stretched out below them, glowing softly in the night like a quiet promise. She thought of her father, who used to say that real change wasn't something you could see right away. It's like rain, he'd told her once, standing on the porch as a storm rolled in. You don't notice what it's doing to the ground until the roots start coming up. Lila opened her eyes as the wheels touched down with a soft thud. The runway lights blurring past the window. In the end, it wasn't about Claudia Hastings, nor the voucher she had received, nor the polite betrayal of Olivia Grant. It was about the ground. The slow, quiet erosion of things that once seemed immovable. The plane rolled to a stop. And as the cabin doors opened, Lila rose calmly, gathering her briefcase and stepping into the aisle. She didn't look at Claudia. She didn't have to. The moment had already settled between them, sinking into the space they'd shared and the silence they'd left behind. As Lila stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she walked without hurry, letting the crowd drift around her. Outside, the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet arrived. Lila smiled softly to herself. It was coming, and when it did, the ground would remember.